Welcome to Reformed Thinking. So, imagine stepping onto a battlefield where the fate of 100,000 people rests totally on whether one single guy can win a fist fight in the dirt.
Right, yeah.
In ancient Israel, they had a very specific, terrifying word for that guy. And believe it or not, it's the very same word they used to describe the pupil of your eye.
Which, I mean, that sounds absurd on the surface. You have brutal physical combat on one hand, and then the most sensitive, delicate part of human anatomy on the other.
Yeah, it makes no sense to us.
But in the ancient Hebrew mind, those two concepts are completely tied together by a single grammatical root.
And that is the focal point for us today. Usually when we think about translating an ancient text, we assume there's a mathematical precision to it, like engineering or something.
Like a one-to-one swap.
Yeah, precisely. Take a word in English, find its equivalent in Hebrew, and the dictionary points and says, there it is, dog equals Perot. Clean, binary, comforting. We like our language to be visible and neatly categorized.
We really do.
But then you look at a massive stack of lexical data, ancient dictionaries, linguistic studies, historical grammar, and suddenly that dictionary is broken.
It falls apart pretty fast.
So today, for our deep dive, we are looking at a single ancient Hebrew word, which is ish, pronounced ish.
Ish.
While this translates to man in your English Bibles, this single word encapsulates ancient Israel's views on biology, marriage, society, warfare, and the nature of God himself. When you see this word, you are looking at an entire worldview compressed into 3 little letters.
And looking at the sheer volume of data we have here from the lexicons, I mean, the Brown Driver Briggs, the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament, the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, you realize very quickly that ancient Hebrew did not function like modern English.
Not even close, right?
No, they categorize reality differently. To understand Tish, we have to strip away our modern Western assumptions about individual identity. We have to look at how the ancient Near Eastern mind constructed the world.
So before we go further, you just threw out a bunch of academic titles. Lexicons, the Theological Dictionary. For anyone who didn't spend 3 years in seminary, what is lexicography?
That's a really helpful clarification to make.
Are we just looking at an ancient Webster's dictionary here?
No, it's not like a modern dictionary that just gives you a brief definition and a pronunciation guide. Ancient Hebrew lexicography is the study of how a word behaves across centuries of literature.
Okay, so it's more historical.
Yeah, you are tracking a word as it moves through legal codes, royal court records, ancient poetry, and apocalyptic visions. You are looking at its etymology, its root, and how the surrounding culture shaped its meaning over time.
I see.
A theological lexicon doesn't just tell you what a word translates to, it tells you how the people using that word understood the universe.
So we're not just defining vocabulary. We are trying to map out the psychology of an ancient civilization.
Spot on.
If this word establishes a framework for how they viewed the universe, we should probably start with the sheer scale of its usage. According to the data, this word appears over 2,160 times in the Old Testament.
That's correct. It is the 6th most frequent substantive noun in the entire Hebrew Bible.
Just to clarify, a substantive noun is what?
Oh, a substantive noun is simply a word that stands in for a distinct, tangible reality. So a person, a place, or a physical object.
Got it.
And you will find it predominantly clustered in the narrative books like Genesis, Judges, and Samuel. It's also heavily featured in the legal codes of Leviticus and Numbers.
Because it's so ubiquitous, it becomes the architectural framework for how the biblical authors describe human relationships.
Yeah, it sets the baseline. But the architecture of the word itself presents a mystery right out of the gate.
The etymology, right. Where does it come from? Because if a word is used 2,160 times, you would assume scholars know its origins.
You would assume so, yeah. But the root is actually heavily debated. However, a very compelling line of linguistic study links to the root just.
And what does that root imply?
This root means to be solid, to be compact, or to shoot up. It implies a firmness, a structural integrity.
Okay, structural integrity.
So at its most basic biological level, it denotes the solid individual male distinct from the female, which is Isha.
So the root suggests a pillar, something firm, standing upright, a singular, solid entity. When you picture a pillar in an ancient stone building, it's independent, it bears weight, and it's highly visible.
That conveys the precise image the ancient mind would have grasped. It projects strength and solidity in its singular form.
It's a very physical, robust concept.
It really is. As an individual, a man is viewed as a structural load bearer in the community, but the linguistic anomalies begin to pile up when you try to pluralize it.
I noticed this in the notes, and it's strange. In Hebrew, you typically just add im to make a
Right.
masculine word plural.
That's the standard rule, yes. So you would logically expect the plural of ish to be ishim.
Which makes perfect sense. The solid man becomes solid men. The solitary pillar becomes a colonnade.
Right, but that literal plural, sijim, is extremely rare. It only occurs 3 or 4 times in the entire Old Testament.
Wow, only 3 or 4 times out of over 2,000 uses.
Yeah, it's almost non-existent. You see it in places like Isaiah 53.3, describing the suffering servant as a man of sorrows, or literally a man of pains among men, sij.
Okay?
But for daily standard usage, the Hebrew language borrows from an entirely different root to form the plural.
I am so confused by this. The data says they pull from the root tisia to create the common plural ānāšîm. Why shift roots? What does it mean?
Well, they completely abandon the root that means solid and adopt a root that carries a very different semantic weight. The root nisha is associated with the word enosh.
And what does enosh mean?
It explicitly implies weakness, frailty, or mortality.
Wait, really? It's like the English word person becoming people, pulling from a completely different linguistic family to describe a group.
It's a very similar grammatical move, yes.
But the semantic shift here is staggering. It feels like a total contradiction. Why would they move from a singular root implying solid and strong to a plural root implying weakness or mortality?
It's a fantastic question.
Does this say something about the human condition when viewed corporately?
It reflects a highly specific theological reality. As an individual, a man might present himself as solid, strong, and ish. He might project an image of autonomy and strength.
Right, the unbroken pillar.
Yeah. But when you gather humanity together corporately, what defines the group is not their collective strength. What defines them is their collective frailty, their mortality, and their shared falling condition.
Oh, wow. So the grammar itself is making a theological statement.
Absolutely. The plural ānāšîm strips away the illusion of absolute human solidity. It points to a post-fall reality where the human race, in its aggregate, is weak and utterly dependent upon their creator.
That is a staggering detail hidden right in the grammar. The language itself possesses a theological memory of human frailty.
It's unavoidable when you read it in Hebrew.
You can pretend to be a pillar on your own, but the moment you are grouped with the rest of humanity, the language reminds you that you are made of dust.
The grammar forces the reader to confront the reality of human limitation. You cannot read the text without bumping into the reality of mortality.
So if this word establishes a man as a solid pillar biologically, what happens when that pillar is placed in the center of a community?
Well, it becomes the load-bearing wall of the ancient household.
And that completely changes how we view marital law. Let's move from biology to sociology.
The second primary definition of ish in the lexicons is husband. When you read the ancient legal texts, this term is the standard vocabulary for marital law.
Okay, so it transitions from just a male to a formal role.
Right. If you look at the laws regarding suspected adultery in Numbers 5, or the laws regulating a woman's vows in Numbers 30, the text constantly uses ish to define the man and his role.
It defines him as the covenantal head of the home, essentially.
Yes, precisely. He is not just a male residing in a house. He is the structural head of that covenant unit. He is the representative.
Which means his actions carry a lot of weight.
The legal codes view the household through his headship. Whatever the Ziz does or whatever legal obligations he assumes bind the household.
So he acts as a proxy.
He is the legal and spiritual proxy for the family before the judges and before God. But the absolute shock for the ancient reader is how the prophets take this domestic legal term and apply it to the absolute sovereign of the universe.
This brings us to Hosea chapter 2. For anyone reading this passage today, it might just sound like a nice poetic metaphor.
Yeah, we read it and think, oh, that's beautiful.
But you mentioned the historical context makes this radical.
To understand the weight of Hosea 2.08, you have to understand the religious climate of ancient Israel at the time. They were constantly tempted by the fertility cults of Canaan.
Specifically the worship of Baal, right?
Right. And the word Baal literally means master, owner, or lord.
So it's a title of dominance.
Very much so. The Canaanite religion was highly transactional. You appease the master, the Baal, through sacrifices, sometimes horrifying human sacrifices, and in return, he gives you rain and crops.
That sounds like a mafia shakedown.
It was a religion of dominance, manipulation, and sheer terror.
It's a master-slave dynamic applied to the weather. You are not trying to know the deity, you're just trying to bribe him so he doesn't starve your family.
The worshiper had no assurance, no security, and certainly no affection for the deity. You just hoped you gave enough to keep him happy.
Okay, so that's the backdrop. That's what Israel is surrounded by.
Yes. But in Hosea 2.18, Yahweh speaks of his future relationship with his rebellious people, Israel. And he issues this incredible declaration, "In that day you will call me Ishi, my husband, and you will no longer call me Bali, my master."
Wow. We are so used to thinking of God as a king or a judge. What changes in the mind of an ancient Israelite when the creator of the universe asks to be called Ishi?
It's a massive shift.
I mean, this is a term they used every day in their own kitchens and living rooms.
It shatters their pagan assumptions about how the divine interacts with the created order. God is sovereignly declaring an end to the transactional, dominance-based religion of Baal.
Because a husband isn't just an owner.
Right. He is establishing a relationship defined by covenantal intimacy. By taking the title Jishe, Yahweh is saying, "I am not just a distant owner demanding tribute. I am the faithful covenantal head who binds myself to you in steadfast love."
It's a radical condescension. The infinite creator uses the vocabulary of human marriage to reveal his posture toward his people.
It truly is.
You think about the difference between a tyrant and a husband.
Yeah.
You obey a Baal out of terror, hoping he doesn't destroy your crops.
Yeah, it's fear-based.
But you respond to a G out of the security of a permanent covenant. It completely redefines the motivation for obedience.
It's the difference between groveling to survive and resting in the care of a faithful head. The use of Isha here moves the relationship from a legal transaction to a binding personal covenant.
Which is incredible when you consider Israel was rebelling at the time.
It's a stunning display of God's grace to a people who are actively pursuing other gods. He offers them covenantal headship instead of destruction.
This intimate relational title defines a man in the home. But how did the ancient language define a man in the public square?
That's where things get really linguistically interesting.
Because the lexicons show this word acting like linguistic glue for almost every vocation in the ancient world.
Scholars refer to this as the man of idiom in Hebrew syntax. Instead of having a unique standalone noun for every possible profession, Hebrew often takes the word yish and attaches it to another noun.
So we just glue words together.
Yeah, to create a title, a vocation, or a description of character, it constructs identity.
Why didn't they just invent a word for sailor? Why go through the linguistic trouble of calling him a man of ships?
Because in their psychology, a job wasn't just something you did from dawn until dusk. It was an ontological reality.
Ontological meaning. It's about being.
Exactly. Oh, yes, it defined your essence. Let's look at the data. We have Ishaharama, literally man of the soil, which is used for Noah in Genesis 9.20 to describe him as a farmer.
Okay, man of the soil.
We have Ishoniult, man of ships, describing a sailor in 1 Kings 9.27. There is Ishadiah Ayad, man knowing hunting, for Esau in Genesis 25.
So Esau is the man of hunting.
And one of the most vivid visual descriptions is Shishbalashur, man of hair, which was the physical description of the prophet Elijah in 2 Kings 1.8.
A man of hair. That's quite a visual. But when you call someone a man of ships, you were saying that the sea, the ships, the maritime life, that is what animates his core being.
Right, he isn't just clocking in for a shift.
Today we might say someone is a company man, or they are made of money. You are identifying them entirely by what consumes them.
That's a great modern parallel.
You are collapsing their identity into the object of their pursuit.
The noun attached to Ij is the defining characteristic of their existence. It's what they are bound to. And this grammatical rule applies not just to jobs, but to intense moral evaluations.
Moral evaluations. How so?
The biblical authors use this construction to deliver devastating assessments of human nature.
Looking at the lexicons, they list several moral categories. You have an ishto, an evildoer. You have an ishtuk, an oppressor.
Yes, those are very common.
But the most severe, the most absolute condemnation in this category is the phrase ishbilia.
That is a very heavy term.
It's often translated as a scoundrel or a man of worthlessness. How does this phrase reflect the biblical view of human corruption?
It reveals a lot.
Are we talking about a few bad choices or a fundamentally corrupted nature?
We are talking about the total corruption of the human will.
Total corruption.
The term balia implies something that is utterly without profit, something ruinous and devoid of any redeeming quality.
Wow. Devoid of any redeeming quality.
When the text calls someone an ishbalia, It's not saying they are a generally good person who occasionally makes a mistake due to bad circumstances.
It's not just a lapse in judgment.
No, it is an indictment of their core nature.
It's the man of idiom again. They're consumed by, animated by, entirely defined by worthlessness.
That's right.
The rebellion is the load-bearing pillar of their identity.
If we connect this to the theological reality of human depravity, this idiom perfectly captures the reality of our condition outside of divine grace.
The corruption isn't superficial.
No, it goes down to the root. And Isbilia is fundamentally unable to produce anything of spiritual value because his very identity is married to rebellion.
So his essence is tied to the rebellion.
Every inclination, every motivation is tainted by this inherent worthlessness.
Think about how countercultural that is.
It really clashes with modern sensibilities.
Modern culture tells us that humans are essentially a blank slate, fundamentally good, and only corrupted by outside influences or bad systems.
Yeah, the noble savage idea.
But the Hebrew grammar refuses to allow that kind of optimism. It locks a person's identity directly to their rebellion.
It leaves no room for inherent human goodness. It's a stark diagnosis of total corruption.
The grammar itself preaches total depravity.
You are what you are bound to. You are a man of the soil, a man of ships, or a man of total rebellion.
And you can't just easily swap those identities out.
There is no way for the Isbilia to simply choose to become something else, any more than a man of ships can suddenly decide to be a man of the soil without a complete dismantling of his life.
He would need a new nature entirely.
Yes, a complete recreation.
That is a heavy linguistic reality. Now, of all these men of descriptions, there is one specific vocation that carries the highest stakes in the ancient Near East.
It's a vocation that changes the scope of the word completely.
It pulls the Ij out of the home, out of the field, and into life or death conflict.
We are looking at the Ij Maloma, the man of war or the warrior.
Looking at the data, this phrase is used constantly to describe soldiers.
Yes, standard military terminology.
But the most astonishing usage is in Exodus 15.3. Israel has just crossed the Red Sea. The Egyptian army has been crushed under the waters, and Moses leads the people in a song of praise.
Song of the Sea.
And the descriptive praise they use for Yahweh himself is, Yahweh is a man of war.
Yes, Yahweh is milioma.
For a listener trying to understand how the ancients viewed God, that feels like a massive leap. You called this an anthropomorphism earlier. What does that mean?
It's a crucial term to understand here.
And why attribute this brutal human title to God?
An anthropomorphism is when you assign human characteristics, emotions, or titles to God in order to make his actions comprehensible to us.
So it's an analogy.
Right. God does not literally possess a physical body with a sword and shield. The Hebrew text literally reads, Yahweh is milima.
Why use that specific phrase then?
They use this title because they have just witnessed the absolute, unrivaled authority of God over the greatest military superpower of their day.
The Egyptian chariot force was the apex predator of the ancient world. They were an unstoppable machine.
And God dismantles them using the sea itself. By calling God a man of war, Israel is confessing that God fights for his people.
He's not passive.
No, he intervenes in history to execute justice and secure salvation. He is not a passive deity watching from a distance. He actively crushes the enemies of his covenant people.
But the lexicons also point out a highly specific subcategory of the warrior, and this is where the theological implications get massive.
This is probably my favorite use of the word in the entire Hebrew Bible.
The term is ij habanaim. In our English Bibles, this is usually translated as champion.
Yes, like in 1 Samuel 17.
The most famous occurrence is describing Goliath of Gath, the giant stepping out to taunt Israel.
Right, everyone knows the story of David and Goliath.
But the literal translation is not champion or giant, is it?
No, it's not. The literal translation is the man of the space between.
The man of the space between. That paints such a vivid picture.
It does. To grasp the terror of this term, you have to visualize the physical geography of ancient warfare.
Okay, set the scene for us.
You have two armies encamped on opposing hillsides. Between them is a valley floor. That valley floor, the space between, is the no man's land.
The killing floor.
Yeah. When two nations were deadlocked, rather than risk the slaughter of their entire populations in a chaotic melee, they would engage in representative combat.
So one nation sends their absolute best, the other sends their absolute best.
Rish Havanaim steps into the gap. He leaves the ranks of his people, walks down the hill into the space between the two armies, and fights the battle that the people cannot fight for themselves.
Think about how we process failure or fear today. When we face an insurmountable obstacle, our culture tells us to look inward,
Right. Try harder. Believe in yourself.
to dig deep and find our inner strength. But if you are an ancient Israelite standing on that hill watching Goliath down the valley, trying harder is a death sentence.
You are paralyzed. You can't just hike yourself up to fight a 9-foot-tall trained killer.
You must look outside yourself to a representative substitute. Isn't this the essence of a representative head?
It is the absolute core of it.
One man stands in the space between, and his victory at her feet is entirely credited to the people standing behind him on the ridge.
The principle of federal headship is baked right into the vocabulary of ancient combat. The destiny of the many rests entirely on the shoulders of the one.
So they are legally tied to his performance.
Yes. If the ďā'naim falls, the entire nation behind him is considered defeated, and they become slaves. They are legally bound to the outcome of his performance.
And if he wins?
If he wins, the entire nation shares in his triumph, even though they never swung a sword, never shed a drop of blood, and never risked their own lives.
It is the absolute imputation of his performance to his people. His victory is legally transferred to their account.
The text in 1 Samuel 17 is setting up a staggering theological paradigm. Israel is cowering on the hillside. They cannot save themselves. They are entirely paralyzed by their own inadequacy.
They are completely helpless.
They need an ďā'naim to step into the gap as their covenantal head. They need him to secure a victory they could never achieve and to credit that victory to their account.
It's the perfect historical shadow of how salvation operates.
It truly is.
That changes how you read the David and Goliath story.
It completely reframes it.
We have turned it into a motivational speech about overcoming the giants in our lives by finding 5 smooth stones of courage or discipline.
Yeah, the Be a David Sunday school lesson.
But it's not an underdog story about trying harder. It's a story about relying completely on a representative substitute.
Well, precisely. You are not David in that story. You are the terrified Israelite shivering on the hill, waiting for a champion to win your salvation for you.
When you understand the word ďā'naim, moralism dies. You realize that your standing before the enemy depends entirely on the perfection of your substitute.
Your own effort contributes absolutely nothing to the victory.
While the physical warrior fights in the valley, Israel relied on a different kind of mediator to bridge the gap between heaven and earth.
Yes, moving from the battlefield to the spiritual realm.
Let's look at another title. ʻănāšîm.
The man of God. This is an incredible phrase, and the lexical data provides a very clear map of how it functions.
How often does it pop up?
It occurs 76 times in the Hebrew text.
Who actually gets this title? Because we use man of God today to describe any pastor or person who goes to church on Sunday.
Yeah, it's become a very generic compliment today.
But the biblical text is much more restrictive, right?
It is an exclusive, highly restricted list. Moses receives it, David receives it. But the primary recipients are Elijah, Elisha, Samuel, and various anonymous messengers.
I am looking at the data, and there is a fascinating anomaly here. This term is heavily clustered in the historical books.
Extremely clustered.
It occurs 55 times in the books of Kings alone, but it is practically never used for the later writing prophets.
No, it almost disappears.
So, if Isaiah wrote one of the longest, most majestic books in the Bible, why isn't he a man of God, while an anonymous, unnamed messenger in Judges 13 is?
This requires us to trace the historical progression of how God administered his covenant.
Okay, walk us through that timeline.
In the earlier periods of Israel's history, during the time of the Judges and the early monarchy with Elijah and Elisha, the ģā'naim denoted a possessor of the Spirit.
A possessor of the Spirit.
This was a person uniquely near to God who performed undeniable physical signs and wonders. They raised the dead, they called down fire from heaven, they multiplied oil.
Their ministry was highly visible, highly miraculous. What were the signs actually doing? Were they just flexing spiritual muscle?
No, it wasn't a magic show. The signs were validating the covenant in a time of extreme national apostasy.
When the nation had gone completely off the rails.
When the nation had abandoned the written law and turned to idols, God raised up these men with raw, miraculous validation to prove that Yahweh was still sovereign.
So the miracles proved their credentials.
The miracles authenticated their status as the ģā'našîm. However, as redemptive history progressed into the era of the great writing prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, The function shifted.
The emphasis moved away from calling down fire.
The emphasis shifted from the sign-working man of God to the covenant prosecuting word-bearer,
And the Hebrew word for that is?
which the Hebrew calls anobeah, a prophet. Isaiah and Jeremiah did not primarily perform physical miracles.
They brought the written law of God to bear upon the nation.
Right. They operated like prosecuting attorneys, reading the terms of the broken covenant to a guilty people.
That makes a lot of sense. The title Man of God is reserved for those unique early figures who bridged the gap through miraculous validation.
Yes.
Whereas the later prophets relied entirely on the authority of the revealed word. The ʻănāšîm was the closest an Israelite could get to the immediate presence of the divine during those chaotic early centuries.
He was the authorized ambassador. He was the mouthpiece of the king, standing in the courts of corrupt human rulers.
But the text is fiercely protective of the boundary between the human and the divine.
It never blurs those lines.
Which brings us to a massive theological chasm in our sources. Let's look at two texts that seem, on the surface, to be in complete contradiction.
The tension here is central to understanding the Hebrew mind.
First, we have Numbers 23.19. The text reads, God is not a man, and see that he should lie, nor a son of man, that he should change his mind.
That is a definitive statement.
The boundary is drawn in permanent ink. God is absolutely not an A.
It is the absolute creator-creature distinction. The text uses the word a specifically in contrast to God to highlight human frailty, mortality, and our capacity for moral failure.
So in this context, age is a negative comparison.
Yes. What is an e? An age is changeable. An age is deceptive. An age is bound by time, weakness, and limited knowledge. God is entirely distinct from all of that.
He doesn't share any of those traits.
He does not lie, he does not repent of his eternal decrees, and his absolute sovereignty is not subject to human limitations or fluctuations.
The data gives a few other verses too.
Right, Job 9.32 says, he is not a man like me that I might answer him. Hosea 11.9 says, I am God and not man.
The infinite creator is on one side, and the finite flawed age is on the other. There is no overlapping territory in their essence.
None whatsoever.
But then we turn to Genesis 18.
Genesis 18 presents a startling narrative that forces the reader to pause.
Set the scene for us.
Yahweh appears to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre, and the text says Abraham looked up and saw three men.
And the Hebrew word there is?
ʻănāšîm, the plural of youths standing nearby.
Wait, pause right there. Numbers says God is not a man. Genesis says Yahweh appeared as a man. How do we synthesize this?
It creates a lot of tension for the reader.
If God is utterly distinct from a man, why do heavenly beings, apocalyptic messengers in Daniel and Zechariah, and Yahweh himself in Genesis 18 cross the boundary and take the visual form of an ish?
It's a heavy question.
You mentioned the word theophany in your notes. What exactly is a theophany? Are we just talking about a vision or a dream, or is this something more tangible?
A theophany is a visible, tangible manifestation of God to humanity. It is not merely a dream. I mean, Abraham prepares a meal, and the men physically eat it.
So it's real, physical interaction in time and space.
Yes. The tension exists to protect two simultaneous truths. The first truth is God's absolute transcendence. In his divine essence, he is entirely separate from the created order.
He's totally other.
The second truth is his sovereign immanence, his ability to draw near, to condescend, and to interact with his creation in a way we can comprehend.
It makes me think of an author writing themselves into a play.
Oh, that's a good way to picture it.
The playwright is absolutely not the characters on the stage.
Yeah.
The playwright exists in an entirely different dimension, a different order of reality.
Right, the author isn't bound by the physics of the stage.
Well, yeah. The characters are bound to the script, the stage, and the timeline of the play, but the author is completely free from those constraints.
They are outside the system.
Yet the playwright can write a character into the story that represents himself. He can step onto the stage to deliver a message, to interact with the characters, without ever losing his identity as the transcendent author outside the play.
That is a highly accurate analogy. When Yahweh takes the form of an ʻănāšîm in Genesis 18 to eat with Abraham, he is not abandoning his divine nature.
He doesn't stop being God.
Nor is he admitting to the moral frailty or limitation of a biological sea. He is sovereignly bridging the chasm. He assumes a form that Abraham can interact with without incinerating Abraham with his unshielded glory.
He accommodates our weakness. If he showed up in the fullness of his uncreated glory, Abraham would be consumed.
It would be fatal, yeah.
So he puts on the visual form of an ish to sit in the shade of a tree and talk to his friend.
The visual form of the tease is a vessel, a gracious accommodation, so that the infinite can commune with the finite.
It preserves the creator-creature distinction while allowing for immense intimacy.
It's a beautiful theological balance.
This bridging of the gap between the individual human and the vastness of God leads us to how the word ish represents collective humanity, and specifically one of the most beautiful idioms in the entire Hebrew language.
Let's start with the concept of absolute corporate solidarity.
Okay, corporate solidarity.
The phrase is kk'id, which translates to as one man.
We use that phrase in English sometimes. They rose up as one man.
Yeah, it's survived into modern usage. In Hebrew, it denotes a terrifying or awe-inspiring unity.
Where do we see that in the text?
You see it when the entire community assembles for judgment in Judges 20, or when an army marches out in complete synchronization. Thousands of individuals operate with a single mind, a single will, KC.
The individual ish is subsumed into the collective whole.
The many function as the one.
The language takes this massive collective concept, thousands of soldiers moving like a single machine, and shrinks it down to the most microscopic, intimate level imaginable.
This is where the vocabulary gets incredibly poetic.
Introduce us to this linguistic gem.
Yishim. Ijon is a diminutive form of ish. When you add the on suffix in Hebrew, it makes the noun small. So literally, Ijon translates to the little man.
Where does this little man live in the biblical text?
It is the ancient Hebrew idiom for the pupil of the eye.
The pupil of the eye is little man.
You find it in places like Deuteronomy 32.0 and Proverbs 7.2. The text says that God kept Israel as the jun, the pupil of his eye.
The little man of the eye. That is stunning poetry. But what is the rationale behind it? Why associate a tiny man with the center of the human eye?
The rationale is actually based on basic human anatomy and the physics of light reflection. When you look very, very closely into someone's pupil, what do you see?
You see a tiny reflection of yourself.
You see a little man, a tiny image of yourself reflected in the dark center of their eye.
Think about the intimacy required for that. You can only see the little man if you are inches away from someone's face.
You have to be incredibly close.
You cannot see the reflection from across a room or from a hilltop or even from a few feet away. You had to be face to face, breathing the very same air.
It requires extreme proximity.
When the text says God protects his people as the yijon of his eye, what does that say about his proximity to us?
It speaks to a sovereign care that is astoundingly intimate. God is not observing his people through a telescope from the distant heavens.
He's not detached.
He is not managing them on a spreadsheet from afar. In Deuteronomy 32, the context is Israel wandering in the howling wasteland of the desert.
They are vulnerable, exposed to predators, and entirely helpless.
And the text declares that God surrounds them, he cares for them, and he guards them as the zun of his eye.
His gaze is so close, so attentive, that the reflection is captured in his vision. They are the center of his focus.
The absolute ruler of history leans in close enough that his people become the little man in his eye.
It is the ultimate expression of covenantal security.
You are held in the direct, unbroken line of his sight. Nothing can approach you without first crossing through his vision.
That is just incredible. Let's take a step back and recap the progression we have tracked today.
We covered a lot of ground.
We started with a solid biological root, the upright pillar of the individual male. We saw that solidity applied to the home through the intimacy of the divine husband, the CG who replaced the tyrannical master of the pagan cults.
Right, moving from fear to covenant.
Then we walked into the public square and saw men defined entirely by their vocations, or trapped entirely by their own total depravity, as the Ish Belial.
The man of worthlessness.
We watched the representative champion, the Ish Habinaim, stand in the space between two armies to secure a victory for his people, legally transferring his triumph to their account.
The federal head.
We identify the man of God who bridged the chasm between heaven and earth as an authorized ambassador. And finally, we zoomed all the way in to see the tiny reflection, the little man in the pupil of an eye, held securely in the sovereign gaze of God.
It is a remarkable linguistic framework that completely reorders how you read the Old Testament. And it's worth noting a final fact from the source text as we wrap up today's deep dive.
What's the final piece of the puzzle?
When the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek, and when the writers of the New Testament took up their pens, they made a sharp division that the Hebrew language held together.
What kind of division?
The Greek language splits the Hebrew concept of ij into two distinct words. They use an ader to specify a male or a husband, and they use anthropos to describe general humanity or a person.
Oh, so they separate the biology from the humanity.
The New Testament writers maintain this strict boundary, but the ancient Hebrew mind, through the single word sish, forced the reader to hold the specific individual and the corporate representative together in one breath.
It forced them to see the pillar and the frail aggregate at the same time.
It's a much more holistic way of viewing identity.
Every time you read the simple word man in an English Bible, you're walking over a massive underground linguistic city. The text is asking you a question. Are you reading about a biological entity, a scoundrel completely consumed by his own rebellion, a champion standing in the space between to win your salvation, or the very reflection of God in the pupil of an eye? Keep looking for the little man in the text.